Don't you love that video? I love that. And one of our staff did that, Dennis. So thank you. Welcome, everybody. My name is Greg Gorger, Executive Director of your Santa Barbara Maritime Museum. Pleasure to have you all here tonight. Everybody doing good? Yeah. Nice and warm inside here compared to outside? Yeah. Well, we are here tonight to hear Conquering the Pacific, An Unknown Mariner, and the Final Great Voyage of the Age of Discovery by Andrés Reséndez. Very excited to have Andres here. You are in for a treat tonight, so you're going to enjoy this. I want to acknowledge all of our board members here. I know I have a couple, three at least, Alex, Randy, Andy. Can you raise your hands? Thank you very much. I always have to acknowledge them. They signed my paycheck. Also want to thank Marie Morris-Rowe, our lecture series sponsor. She has sponsored, yes, let's hear it from Marie. She has sponsored the next almost 5 years of these lectures, so very happy to have her here. I want to thank Art from SevTap, who's here tonight, and Giordano's. Everybody get something to drink tonight? Yeah. All right, wonderful, wonderful. So, very excited to introduce Dr. Andrés Reséndez, who is an author and professor of history at the University of California, Davis, where his research is focused on early European exploration and colonization of the Americas and the early history of the Pacific, including the voyages of discovery. Dr. Reséndez grew up in Mexico City and earned his bachelor's degree in international relations at El Colegio de Mexico and has a doctorate in history at the University of Chicago. Before assuming his current position at UC Davis, he was active in politics, served as a consultant for historical soap operas, and taught at Yale University and the University of Helsinki in Finland. His most recent book, Conquering the Pacific, An Unknown Mariner, and the Final Great Voyage of Discovery, which I had the pleasure to read, was released in 2021 and details the first expedition to sail from America to Asia and back. They found the Vuelta, which you'll learn more about tonight, transforming the Pacific Ocean into a vital space of contact and exchange. Beyond telling the amazing story of this lesser-known and keystone accomplishment in global exploration, his research and narrative uncovers the story and changes the credit of the man who first completed this milestone. His previous book, The Other Slavery, The Uncovered Story of Indian Enslavement in America, was a finalist for the 2016 National Book Award and winner of the 2017 Bancroft Prize from Columbia University. His earlier books include A Land So Strange, The Epic Journey of Cabeza de Vaca, and Changing National Identities at the Frontier, Texas and New Mexico, 1800 to 1850. Awarded a Carnegie Fellowship in 2020 for his accomplishments in Mexican, Iberian, and exploration history, he joins us this evening as the current Robert C. Ritchie Distinguished Fellow at the Huntington Library in Pasadena. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrés Reséndez.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much. It is so exciting to be here amongst friends, and it is great to be able to share some of the work that I did over the last 7 or 8 years, putting together these incredible story. I find at least incredible. So let's get going. So as everyone knows, a Genoese navigator brought the Atlantic world into existence in 1492. And yet a similar Columbian moment occurred out here in the Pacific, even though we remain, I would say, scandalously ignorant about it at a time when the world's center of gravity moves ever more firmly to the Asia-Pacific region. As we know, Pacific navigators first crossed the great ocean by island hopping from the coast of China to the Americas. 3 years ago, we learned from DNA evidence that Native Americans and Polynesians made contact sometime around the 12th or 13th century. We don't know exactly where, but that contact occurred. This was certainly very exciting, but it proved to be fleeting. And by that I mean that by the time Europeans arrived in the New World in the late 15th and 16th century, that link across the Pacific had already been lost. And so it would be during the first half of the 16th century when a series of daring ventures finally established that permanent trans-Pacific contact. And you know, many people think that Magellan did it, but really Magellan did only the first part of the job, the first leg of the job. He was the first one to go in one swoop from, as you can see, from the tip of South America all the way through to Guam, and then what is now the Philippines, where he ended his days. But his expedition, his remaining expedition, tried to return by the same way that he had come from, and unsuccessfully. So we talk about Magellan's voyages as circumnavigation, but that's because he couldn't really do the Vuelta. He couldn't return the same way he did it, so he had to go the long way around back to where he was coming from. But the Spanish Empire was very keen on opening the Pacific as a possible trade route. The Portuguese had reached the Far East by then, and they were conducting a very profitable trade with India and China, and by way of Africa, and the Spanish crown was racing with them, and they were trying to open the other route across the Pacific. But it was extremely difficult. So in the course of the 1520s, the 1530s, and the 1540s, Spain dispatched no less than 7 expeditions to open this new route to the incredible riches of the Far East. And all of these voyages ended in disaster. I mean, some of them were vanquished by the enormity of the Pacific. The Pacific is roughly twice as large as the Atlantic. Some of them were marooned in islands of the Pacific. But the main problem is that they could go from the Americas to Asia, but once in Asia, there was no return. So here's a map of some of these attempted vueltas, return voyages. You know, it was very difficult, as you would imagine. They were in the Philippines. They really wanted to get back to America, but they had to do that at the right time of the year, and they had to find that little patch of the ocean where the sailing conditions were propitious to get back to America. And so that was pretty difficult to do. And so the expedition that concerns us today finally achieved that return voyage. That expedition, up until now, is, has been known only to a few specialists, but it is really a very dramatic expedition that finally really turned the largest ocean on Earth into a vital space of human contact and exchange. It was the Columbian moment of the Pacific. No expenses or efforts were spared. So there we go. So no expenses were spared. This all-out effort was sponsored by Philip II, the man on your left. He was the monarch, the Spanish monarch, after whom the Philippines were named. But the individual who actually put together the expedition was the man on the right. He was the Viceroy of Mexico, Don Luis de Velasco. He lived in Mexico City. He was a royal official with big dreams and ideas, and for whom money was no object. He really spent a lot more than what he had at his disposal in order to make this happen. Yeah, he was a spendthrift, crazy kind of a guy. So Don Luis commissioned the construction of 2 enormous galleons of more than 500 and 400 tons of burden. So now, from the perspective of the 21st century, this may seem small, but really at the time, these were gigantic vessels, probably the biggest ones ever built up to that time in the New World. Just to give you a sense of scale, Columbus's flagship in the voyage of discovery, the Santa Maria, was no more than 100 tons. And the largest ship in Magellan's circumnavigation voyage, the San Antonio, was about 120 tons. So these 2 vessels were 4 or 5 times larger than those, just to give you a sense of scale. These great construction effort took 7 years. And this was done not in Acapulco, as you can see on the map. The Acapulco is, for those who have been there, is a horseshoe perfect bay, very well protected, with very impressive cliffs all around, with a sandy bottom, so it's very safe for the ships. That would have been a lot more sense, but to keep this expedition secret from the Portuguese, they chose a dilapidated port far to the north of Acapulco called Barra de Navidad, which you can see in the map there. This was a problem because this place offered absolutely no suitable building materials. So nearly everything had to be brought in, adding enormously to the expense, as you would imagine. So they had to bring, for example, nails all the way from Spain. They had to bring rope and rigging from Nicaragua. They had to bring large trees for the masts from Oaxaca. They had to get anchors and sails from Veracruz. They had to get water barrels from Acapulco. The cost of all of these was astronomical. I mean, we could spend the next hour talking about the logistical nightmare that this was. And not only that, but this place was rather dangerous. Just a decade before this expedition, or a little more than a decade, a massive insurrection took place in this region called Nueva Galicia. So this is a map made in 1550 or 1552. I'm not entirely sure. If you look towards the bottom of the screen, right, okay, I can't quite see that, but I think it's here. This, if you could read the Spanish gloss, it says Puerto de Navidad, so this is the Port of Navidad. Here is a close-up of that, so you can see it's a lagoon with two little islands in the middle, and then there is attached to a bay. That little house there represents the little hamlet that existed there, and that's where the construction people would have lived while they were building these gigantic 2 vessels. And eventually it would be 4. The whole fleet would consist of 4 ships, these 2 enormous galleons and 2 much smaller vessels that would do that. This is what the place looks like today. So you can still see the general outlines of a lagoon with a couple of islands in the middle and a sandy area that protects these lagoon. In addition to building these enormous ships and bringing everything from wherever it needed to be brought, so at an astronomical cost, the king himself and the Spanish crown tried to recruit a dream team of sorts equal to the enormity of the task at hand. And so the most notable of these hand-picked individuals was a friar by the name of Andrés de Urdaneta. Here's an image of him. He was a man with the greatest nautical pedigree that you could imagine at the time in the middle of the 16th century in Mexico. As a teenager, nearly 40 years earlier, Urdaneta had become an apprentice to none other than the captain who had completed the first circumnavigation of the world. So as I just mentioned, Magellan actually died in the Philippines. And so another Spanish man, Sebastián Elcano, completed that first circumnavigation, and Urdaneta was his apprentice. After Elcano returned to Spain, Urdaneta became his apprentice. And in that capacity, Elcano and Urdaneta would go on the Spanish mounted a second circumnavigation expedition after that very first famous first one. Nobody knows about the second one. It proved to be a disastrous expedition. Urdaneta himself was stranded for almost 10 years in the Southeast Asia, in some of the islands of Southeast Asia but he survived through all of that. And this is very key because he learned about the particular winds, especially the monsoon winds in that area that would be absolutely key to unlocking the secret of the Vuelta. So he kept exploring the Pacific after he returned to Spain first, and then he lived in Mexico. But when he was in his 40s, he decided to reconsider his life, and he took his vows in an Augustinian convent in Mexico City, and as he put it, to live out the balance of my life in quiet and peace. But of course, it was not meant to be, because once this expedition got going, King Philip II himself wrote a letter to Urdaneta requesting his services and thus plucking the friar out of his quiet retreat for one final life or death expedition. The other main character of our expedition, the protagonist really, was this remarkable Afro-Portuguese man named Lope Martin. So there's no image, no likeness of him, but his family had been enslaved and taken to Portugal, to the southeast of Portugal, to a region called the Algarve. Maybe some of you have been there, which was at the time the preeminent maritime region of the world. That is where black people like himself performed the most menial and grueling jobs aboard both Portuguese and Spanish ships of exploration. So Lope Martin himself, even though his parents and probably his grandparents, etc., had been enslaved and taken to Portugal, he himself was a free mulatto in the parlance of the day. And he was also an immensely talented navigator. One of those guys who always seemed to know exactly what to do aboard a vessel. And over the years, he rose through the ranks until he became a licensed pilot, the highest occupation to which a man like himself could ever aspire to. Now, I'll just say one more thing about him. This required passing examinations. So Spain had an agency with the job of licensing pilots. And so you had to own your charts. You had to be able to demonstrate that you could locate your position by calculating the altitude of the sun with respect to the horizon, and you had to be a very good sailor with at least 5 years of experience. So it was a major accomplishment. Jumping from being a regular sailor to a pilot was a huge jump, and he somehow was able to do it in spite of his skin color. And not only that, but he became his reputation was so sterling that he was specifically recruited for this particularly difficult expedition to try to find the return voyage from Asia to the New World. So he must have been really amongst the foremost pilots of the era. So after accepting a very high salary of 1,000 pesos for the entire voyage, an enormous salary, he signed up on the mission and went to Navidad along with Urdaneta and the others to inspect the ships and to meet the crews. And so it was that on November the 20th, 1564, all of these voyagers boarded their respective ships and got ready to depart. And at about 2, for reasons that I don't know, that I don't understand, at around 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning, so in the darkest hour, the flagship finally fired a salvo, and a crier said something along the lines of, "Ease the rope of the foresail in the name of the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, 3 persons in one single true God, that they may be with us and give us a good and safe voyage and carry us and return us safely to our homes." That was the cry of the thing. Of course, things did not go smoothly from the very beginning. In the 16th century, vessels did not come equipped with GPS or radio communications. So merely 10 days after departing from Navidad, during a storm that lasted 3 or 4 days, the smallest of the 4 ships, the San Lucas, and remember that name because this will be the key vessel, the San Lucas, piloted by the black man Lope Martin, became separated from the other 3 vessels. They would thus continue the voyage separately all the way to the Philippines. And along the way, both of these parts of the expedition visited and sketched out some of the Micronesian islands that they found along the way. and provided some of the earliest descriptions that we have of their inhabitants. So, you know, I have a couple of, so this is just for reference purpose, but I took some images of the documents, of the logs of the pilots of this expedition, and you can see the pilots took the time to sketch some of these lone, small islands in the middle of the ocean. Those little dots that you see attached to the island are coral, so they also recorded the coral. And of course, they also encountered atolls like this one, and they are also represented in these documents, these 16th century documents, as you can see them, also fringed with coral all over. So these, as you would imagine, would have been incredible death traps for the Spanish vessels, because, I mean, you could escape the sea for a little while, you could drop the anchor and rest for a while, but you may not be able to get out once you did that. So they had to resist the temptation to do that. They also found some of the islanders, and you know, they marveled at their incredible prowess in the sea with their very unusual craft, with their very unusual vessels that were nonetheless very fast and very efficient. So we learn a lot. I mean, we learned these are some of the first glimpses that we have of these Micronesian islanders recorded. So anyways, so the San Lucas, the vessel piloted by Lope Martin, arrived in the Philippines 2 weeks before the rest of the expedition. So you can see right there, so this is Lope Martin right there, and the San Lucas that touched land in the southernmost of the Philippine islands, Mindanao, a huge island, the second largest island in the Philippines, and then proceeded to round Mindanao by the southern end, and then they stopped at the Davao Gulf that you can see there. I can't quite see from here, but you know, I think it's around here. Is that correct? Yeah. They spent there about a month doing repairs and trading with some people that they found there. And then they would continue rounding the island, and then they sailed right through the middle of the archipelago in the hopes of finding the other vessels. The rest of the expedition, the Legazpi, arrived much farther north. I can't quite see there, but is it there, maybe? And they also went through to the middle of the archipelago. In fact, they all came nearly close together, close to the island that they, at the time, they called the Magellan's Island, because that's the island where Magellan had met his end. And so all the mariners of that time knew that as Magellan Island. But they didn't really arrive at the same time. So even though their two trajectories converged, they never quite found each other. And so Lope Martin and the crew of the San Lucas faced an agonizing choice, which was to continue searching for the other vessels, all the while consuming their dwindling food supplies, or they could also go to the Spice Islands, which could be reached with only a few weeks of sailing, where the Portuguese were already deeply entrenched, and they could surrender to the Portuguese. And after all, Lope Martin is from Portugal originally, so he would at least expect to be received by them. Or they could attempt the return voyage by themselves, which had never been done successfully before. And remember, this is the smallest of the four vessels. These vessel had been made in order to support the two largest vessels, but the idea was that the return voyage would be done by one of the large two galleons. That was the whole plan. So the plan was not for these small vessels to return, but they had no option. And so thus the San Lucas began the most improvised vuelta ever attempted on the Pacific on Easter Sunday, April the 27th, 1565. And these would be really an epic voyage that would include mutiny, marvelous sightings, unforeseeable dangers, and a near shipwreck. And it would be the first west to east crossing of the Pacific in recorded history. And as we said at the beginning, it would jumpstart this continuous trans-Pacific flow of germs, plants, animals, peoples, and ideas that endures until today. And this voyage, so consequential and still so little known, would be accomplished thanks almost entirely to the skill of this Afro-Portuguese pilot, Lope Martin. This fateful decision happened almost by accident. And as you can see, if you look at the top of your screen, on April 21st, the men of the San Lucas reached an opening between the islands of Samar and Luzon in the northern Philippines, and that is called the San Bernardino Strait. And so after passing through the strait, they could see no more islands ahead, so they had reached the end of the archipelago. And the wind, the currents are notoriously strong on the San Bernardino Strait, and there was hardly any wind that day. So the San Lucas started drifting into the open ocean. And so the captain of the San Lucas asked his pilot, and I quote, to consider carefully the best course in the service of God, His Majesty, and to save everyone aboard. And Lope Martin responded, and we have his exact words. He said that it was best to return to Mexico because the summer season was about to start, and if we could gain enough altitude towards the north, we would find very favorable conditions, and that would be better than being captured by the islanders or by the Portuguese. So I quote the pilot at length here because his insight is very clear right there. He needed to go way north, as he noted, because, I mean, for reasons that I'll explain in a second, and you also needed to do that at the right time of the year in order to find favorable winds. So let's start with the first one. So basically, it was relatively easy to go from Acapulco or from Navidad, from the coast of Mexico, to the Philippines because you basically just were following the southern edge of the North Pacific gyre. So these enormous circle of winds and currents circling the ocean, the North Pacific, with some regularity. So there was another one in the southern Pacific, the South Pacific gyre. So basically, if you were sailing above or below the equator and going from the Americas to Asia, you could count on these favorable winds and currents. But in order to return, you needed to go way north in order to get to the northern portion of the North Pacific gyre and find the same favorable currents. So that was one problem. And the second problem was that they had to do that at the right time of the year to benefit from the monsoon, dramatic seasonal wind change. And although most people associate the monsoon with the Indian Ocean, in fact, it extends into the Western Pacific, including the Philippines and the China Seas. And this 180 shift in wind direction stems from the cooling and warming of the Asian landmass. So basically in the spring, we are transitioning into the southwest monsoon, which would provide winds going exactly where Lope Martin and his crew wanted to go. They wanted to go north and started going a little to the east in order to veer towards the Americas. Okay, so this is the trajectory. The San Lucas voyagers climbed for weeks to 31 degrees of northern latitude. They intended to stop at Japan. So again, they had a very crude understanding of this region. Nobody really had done that. And so all they knew was that Japan was to the north, and they wanted to get to Japan, if nothing else, to get more fresh water and provisions there. But Japan was nowhere in sight. The only speck of land that they saw on the way was this remarkable pillar that the Japanese called Sofugan and the British called Lot's Wife. And it's and here's what it says. It was very narrow, no more than a small house, but it was so tall that I don't believe there's a higher tower anywhere else in the world. This sighting allows us to place these expeditions some 400 miles due south from Tokyo. And as I said, it was the only land that they would see. Even today, people try to go to Sofugan, and they run into trouble very quickly. There's really nothing. It's very dangerous to get close to these, rock outcropping. So they continued, and they continued to climb up to 43 degrees of northern latitudes, directly south of the Aleutian Islands, right? That necklace of islands stretching from the Kamchatka Peninsula all the way to Alaska. And the pioneers ran into frigid ocean, and they wrote about it. The captain said, "We faced the greatest cold of winter, even though it was in the middle of summer in June and July." On June 11th, for example, snow fell on the deck and did not melt until noon. Remember, this is also happening in what is sometimes called as the Little Ice Age, so temperatures were colder than they are today. Lamp oil became so frozen that the bottle in which it was kept had to be warmed over a fire, and it still came out in pieces like lard. That's what one of the logs points out. And during these long passage, of course, the sails began to shrivel. The San Lucas carried no extra sails or even mending equipment, so the crews had to hand sew the tears with fishing line, and eventually they would even have to part with their blankets and even their clothes to patch the holes. But the most dangerous enemy was not the cold or the wind or the lack of sails, but it was the rats. After 2 months at sea, and this almost defies imagination, but this is what they say. These rat population aboard became thirsty, aggressive, and ready to do anything. And the only available water on the San Lucas was sealed in 8 casks of water. That's all they had, 8 casks of water. And in desperation, and I quote the captain, the rodents turned to gnawing on the barrels. One day, the thirsty creatures perforated 2 barrels in as many hours, spilling all their contents. And by that point, out of 8 barrels of water, they only had 3 left, certainly quite inadequate for a crew of 20. And they were still kind of in the middle of the Pacific. And so to defend what little water they had, the expeditionaries were forced to post a 4-man guard day and night below deck to prevent the rodents from gnawing on the casks. They had to also lit fires, something really dangerous with these wooden boats below deck in order to see when the rodents were attacking. But the rodents kept attacking. That was the only water, and they would not be deterred by anything. That was their survival on the line. And the captain says that we killed between 20 and 30 rats every night, which again defines imagination, but that's what he writes. Weeks of agonizing sailing in a southerly direction brought the voyages ever closer to the continent until the evening of July 16, 1565, when the North American coastline became finally faintly visible in the distance. It had taken them 3 months since they had decided to return to the Americas in the Philippines. So 3 months, a pretty fast return. Considering that the average was 6 months later on when the Manila Galleon was established. From that point onward, the San Lucas voyagers must have expected a comparatively safer coastal passage to Navidad, but in fact, the most dangerous moment occurred not in the middle of the ocean, but right before reaching their destination. After 10 days of coastal sailing, the expeditionaries were running fast, with all sails out and strong breeze pushing from behind. But as the wind continued to strengthen, the pilot finally gave the order to shorten the mainsail, and unfortunately, it was too late. A few sailors climbed up the mast and started gathering the sails, but as the ship captain recalled, and I quote him, "We were suddenly hit by a blast of wind, sea, and rain, and the blow was so hard that the sails tore away from the hands of the sailors, knocking open 2 or 3 heads and flinging 2 men on the deck. The San Lucas turned a beam to the wind and the large waves heaving violently with the mast almost touching the water, and the men hanging onto anything they could to stay inside the vessel. And everything above and below deck became pandemonium. And this is what the captain said, and we could not tell if it was land or sea. Everything on the deck was swept away along with the helmsman. So no helmsman from then on. The sailors regained control eventually with some of the sails in tatters, but not before the San Lucas was swept off course, which explains these very curious little trajectory that you see around here when they are sailing around here. But the last few days were agonizing as the ship essentially limped into Navidad, carrying men who were naked, thirsty, hungry, and showing very advanced signs of scurvy. They arrived on August the 9th, 1565, and it took them in altogether 3 months and 20 days to finally connect Asia and America. So the very first time in recorded history, people had gone from the Americas to Asia and back. And of course, their bold passage caused a burst of excitement in Mexico. America was poised to become the axis mundi, the bridge between the East and the West. And Lope Martin and the other crew members were treated to a hero's welcome. Yet, their moment of glory ended quite swiftly. 2 months after the arrival of the San Lucas at Navidad, another ship in the expedition also washed up on the coast of Mexico. It was the flagship of the expedition, and this one arrived all the way in Acapulco. As you will recall, only 10 days after the start of the expedition, the San Lucas had separated from the rest of the fleet, almost surely due to a storm. However, in the eyes of the commanding officers of the 3 ships that remained together, this separation had been intentional rather than owing to the weather. And a lawyer representing the expedition's commander, Miguel López de Legazpi, and this is why this expedition usually is called the Legazpi expedition, formally accused the crew of the San Lucas of, quote, absconding and becoming absent from the fleet under the cloak of night without cause and when the sea was calm and the weather was good. The accusation was baseless, as I tried to show in my book, yet it triggered an investigation that threatened Lope Martin's life, the Afro-Portuguese pilot of the San Lucas, who had been unquestionably the first mariner to go back and forth across the largest ocean in the world. And here's how the Spanish crown intended to repay the Columbus of the Pacific for his services. On the surface, everything seemed to proceed normally. The Crown outfitted yet another vessel, this one at Acapulco. Here's an image of that bay. This is a later image from the 17th century. This is still in the 16th century. To send to the Philippines to resupply the men, the Spanish, who had remained in the Philippines behind in Asia. And for this additional voyage, what better pilot than to hire the extraordinary Lope Martin, who had already done it and back. But left unsaid, of course, was an ulterior motive, and that is that by sending the black man back to the Philippines meant that he would have to appear before the fleet commander, who would finally get the satisfaction of bringing justice to the pilot who, in his eyes, had deserted the rest of the fleet in the middle of the ocean. And moreover, and this is the scrap of information that triggered my interest 25 years ago in this voyage, the notary aboard the vessel carried a letter in a sealed envelope stating that Lope Martin was to be hanged upon arrival in the Philippines. But there was one problem, only one problem with this plan, and that is that the notary leaked the sealed document's contents, and Lope Martin's talent as a pilot was only surpassed by his skill as a plotting and conspiring individual. And so thus began this remarkable voyage in which the pilot had absolutely no reason to reach his destination because he knew he would be hanged upon arriving to the Philippines. And to save his life, he instigated a mutiny in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth. And I'm going to finish very, very quickly. But as one of the travelers put it, and one of the mariners who went there, he said, if Homer and Virgil had come, they would have needed to summon all of their abilities to convey the hunger, destruction, deaths, cries, sighs, imprisonments, travails, delays, afflictions, and all the calamities and shipwrecks that we experienced. So it was a bad voyage. Martin's mutiny actually succeeded and allowed him to take complete control of the vessel. And for a time, Martin became a pirate beyond the pale of imperial control. However, a counter-mutiny caused the Afro-Portuguese and 26 of his men to be marooned in Ujalan Atoll, which you can see here. This is in the Marshall Islands. It's one of the westernmost atolls in the Marshall Islands. These group of 27 people were all seasoned navigators, well armed and determined to stay alive. And even though the trail goes cold at this point, some indirect evidence suggests that Martin and his followers survived for years in Micronesia in the middle of the Pacific. This would have been a very fitting end for the first individual to sail back and forth across the great ocean. And so this is how Lope Martin's achievement turned out to be of monumental importance. After 1565, for 2.5 centuries, Spanish galleons sailed yearly from the coast of North America to the Philippines, carrying silver to Asia and returning with silk, porcelain, spices, and other wondrous products. By the way, you have a couple of incredible porcelain pieces here from that era, from the 16th century and early 17th centuries. In a few short years, the Philippines became a major hub where merchants from China, Japan, and elsewhere in Asia gathered to trade with the Americas. And by the 18th and 19th centuries, American merchants built on these early linkages to launch their own trans-Pacific ventures. As the Spanish Empire in the Americas crumbled in the early 19th century, American ships replaced the old galleons, and eventually the United States seized Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines and tapped into markets in Japan and China, building on these earlier accomplishments that we just talked about tonight. So thank you so much. All right. Thank you. So I would be happy to take any questions, comments. Yes?
Why did they put the magnificent navigator on the little boat instead of one of the big?
I mean, they obviously, I have some letters about the problem of apportioning. So they had men, there were a few women, but mostly men, and there were the pilots. There were 6 pilots in total. So some of these, they actually wanted to get 8 pilots because the idea was to get 2 pilots per boat, but they couldn't get the 8 of the right caliber, so they only had 6. And so in the end, they decided to concentrate the very best pilots, the best charts in the flagship, and then put another 2 pilots and some really good resources in the second largest galleon. And I imagine that it's partly because of the color of his skin that they put the mulatto pilot in the smallest dispatch vessel. Nonetheless, the captain was probably the most socially prominent man in the entire expedition. So again, I can't explain why they would put the most noble, the highest ranking individual in that ship with the pilot. But no, but I have one more thing, which is that the fleet normally followed one ship, and the small ship was at the head. So in other words, Lope Martin was actually guiding the entire fleet. So again, maybe a recognition of his extraordinary skill. I don't know. Yes?
Isn't there some evidence that the Chinese made the trans?
Yeah, I've read that book. I'm very skeptical because the evidence seems very flimsy to me. But yeah, I know that there is a claim made to that effect. Yeah. Yes?
I've read somewhere, I guess it was a book on the Manila
I've been failing to repeat the question. So the question here is whether, so the part of the expedition that remained in the Philippines under Legazpi, who is the captain, the fleet commander, whether they landed in San Miguel Island in the Philippines. Oh, here. Oh. Okay, so that's when Legazpi returned? Is that where you're... Well, Legazpi stayed in the Philippines. He didn't return.
But there was the second ship.
The ship returned, but I've looked at the records and I don't think they stopped anywhere. They really didn't want to stop around here. They were really worried about running aground. I mean, there are some farallones, like in the San Francisco, and they were really spooked by those. So they wanted to keep their distance from the shore. So, so I don't have information about this.
Right.
Yeah, many of them are. I mean, most of my documents are either in Mexico or in Spain. Spain has this great repository called the Archivo General de Indias in Seville, and a lot of it is actually digitized as well. I mean, for the 16th and 17th century, they have digitized hundreds of thousands of records. So unfortunately for us, because we would love to go to Seville, but some of that can be accessed directly from your computer. Anyone can go in there. There are some documents in Mexico. I also went to Manila. Didn't find much there. I also went to Guam. And again, there are some transcripts, but nothing original there. So, yeah. The question is, how on earth would a vessel like this get so many rats? And so first of all, some context. Rats are extremely diagnostic of human colonization because rats don't swim across the ocean. So, so you find some rats. So when you find rats remains, well, first of all, if you find, so originally many of the Pacific Islands had no rats whatsoever, and when rats first arrived, they experienced a population boom. And they, you see seeds that have a very diagnostic gnawing by the rats. And so you know some of the dating of the human occupation of various islands have been used on the basis of the ships arriving with rats and the rats becoming, established for the first time ever. So this is, for example, how well, anyways, I could go. But the point is, many of these rats, interestingly, are coming from Asia. So that's a species of rat that is from Asia, which is very distinct from the two types of rats that are coming from Europe that later on arrived there. So I can only imagine that these were Asian rats that they are bringing. As to the question of how come they had so many, then I'm no biologist, so I can't answer that question. But I can say one thing, which is that for the first part of the voyage, they experienced 1 month of nearly continuous rain. So the rats would have been able to drink water. But then after that first month, wet month, things dried up, and that's when the rats started attacking the. So they were able to survive fine during the first part of the expedition, but then it became really difficult.
So they started out with the pills?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
At the beginning of the voyage?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, they stayed 1 month in these Davao. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
On behalf of the museum, we have a little gift for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wasn't that wonderful? Thank you, everybody. Safe travels home. We hope to see you back soon. Next month, Janet Sands. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.